they don't want to talk to you about your product or service unless your product or service is somehow helping them navigate this storm. And that goes back to pivoting the message, which is a marketing issue and a sales issue.
Welcome to the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, hosted by Bernie Borges. This is the podcast for the modern marketer who wants to hear from their peers in the trenches and the occasional analyst or rockstar influencer, sharing strategies and tactics about what's working in modern marketing. Be sure to listen to the end of each episode for Bernie's summary and takeaways so you can plan your next move in your own modern marketing journey.
Hey there, welcome to episode 279 of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. I'm Bernie Borges, CMO of Vengreso, and your host. Hey, thanks for listening. Hey, my guest on this episode is Jillian Ryan, eMarketer Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence. Jillian, welcome to the Modern Marketing Engine podcast.
Hey, Bernie, really happy to be here.
Glad to have you. I was nervous about saying your title. It's long. We joked about it back in the green room, the digital green room.
Yeah, it
But I
could be
think
a little bit of a mouthful.
yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Well, Jillian, we are here to talk about just a couple of ways that B2B companies are pivoting in the COVID world.
Oh, yeah.
But first, as I always like to begin each episode, let's start with a brief introduction to your company for those that may not be familiar with eMarketer and some recent news that I just learned about the company as well.
Yeah, no, happy to kind of dive behind the scenes to give a little context to who I am and who eMarketer is and Insider Intelligence. So about me first, I'm a principal analyst at eMarketer, which means it is my job to do research, talk to really smart executives about what is happening in digital marketing. My beat specifically relates to B2B marketing, sales, advertising, and what I like to call marketing transformation. I've been with the company for almost 5 years at this point, and I also like to call myself a recovering marketer because I used to be brand side for B2Bs doing the marketing for them. And now I just like to think about marketing and talk about it. eMarketer has been around for 25 years, a really well-respected research firm that's very comprehensive and vets data to really make sure that we're distilling information. And recently we just combined with Business Insider Intelligence, one of our sister companies under Axel Springer. We're both owned by the German corporation. And we recently just rebranded as Insider Intelligence. But the eMarketer vertical is alive and well. All the analysts are still on staff producing the same great content we always have. And now we have plenty of other colleagues that are focusing on other areas of digital transformation and innovation outside of marketing. So really taking more of a tech angle. So it's a really exciting time to be at the company. And quite honestly, I think COVID has really given us a leg up. I think a lot of companies are out there figuring out how do they stay relevant in COVID? How do they pivot their strategies? And that's what we've been working on since the start of the pandemic to make sure that our research is as relevant and pertinent to our clients as well.
Okay, terrific. Well, I had the privilege of contributing to one of your pieces recently. That's how we
Yes,
met.
my
You
account-based
interviewed
marketing
me.
report.
Yeah, you interviewed me, and then I thought, hey, let me turn the tables and interview you on my podcast. So here we are.
I always love it. I spend most of my time interviewing. So when I get to be on the other end of it, it's a little bit more exciting for me.
I know the feeling. When I get to be on the other end of a podcast microphone as a guest, I enjoy that as well. So, all right. So, one takeaway that I want to be clear for my listeners that the eMarketer brand is alive and well, right?
hmm
Okay, fantastic. All right. So, let's get to our main topic: two ways that B2B companies are pivoting in the COVID world. So,
Yes.
why don't you tee up that first one? Let's have some conversation around that because I know we're ready to have some good conversation around that.
Yeah, no, so I think I just mentioned that, at Insider Intelligence, we're working to produce relevant content. So obviously, when I pitched my reports to my editor at the start of the year, I wasn't thinking about pivots that would need to be made in a COVID world. But just as businesses have had to pivot, we also pivoted our content strategy. And I recently just published a report that's actually entitled B2B Best Practices in a COVID-19 World, 8 Initial Pivots and How They Can Drive Long-Term Digital Transformation. transformation. And I think the real theme there is that business and marketing plans that were conceived earlier this year or at the end of 2019, they no longer work in this new environment that's rapidly changing. So that means that B2B companies have to alter how they sell or even what they sell in order to really adjust to the economic and societal conditions that have been brought, upon by this pandemic that we're still living in. I think one of the main ones, and Bernie, you and I kind of chatted up top on what we think the two highlights are. And the obvious one is really, B2B marketers and sellers use in-person events, use these big conferences and trade shows as a
Mhm.
major touch point within the buyer's journey to connect with prospects, to connect with sellers. And those no longer exist.
Mhm.
At least for the time being, they're no longer on the table. So that means that budgets need to shift, how sellers connect with their audience needs to shift, the way that marketers are sharing content and research. Normally they would present a big keynote. That's no longer happening. And we're seeing that means that digital virtual events are becoming a lot more prominent, but it also means that budgets are shifting to other channels too. And it's been a really interesting thing to see how companies kind of, decided to pause, I think in like mid-March, and wait and see. And now they're really starting to decide where to spend, and how to do that in a thoughtful and careful way.
Mhm. What impact do you think that's had on sales teams? Because, marketing and sales are hand in glove. They've got to work together. And if marketing has had to do this pivot, then what impact has that pivot had on the sales teams at B2B companies?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Something that I heard in my interviews that I was doing was that initially sales teams were kind of left in the wilderness at some companies because marketing was busy pivoting and kind of the kind of go to market was pivoting, and even like what do we sell was pivoting. And sales leaders need to make sure they give their sellers information. Like they can't just have them out there not knowing how cadences should shift, not knowing how the message should shift. What happens if I don't reach my quota? Like even those internal questions about the sellers and their job security, like all of those came into question at the start of this pandemic. So there's some internal stuff that companies need to be doing in terms of just communicating the changes in quota, in compensation, in job security and sales enablement, but then also externally making sure that teams are equipped. There was a LinkedIn survey. LinkedIn puts out their state of sales report every year, and
Hmm.
this year they had a COVID spin to it, and they asked sales professionals in North America, how has the digital sales practice changed as a result of COVID-19? 77% of those respondents said that they were holding more video meetings, which I think
Hmm.
is a given. But does your sales team have the right technology and equipment? Did you give them access to a corporate Zoom account or a Google Hangouts or whatever technology that you're going to give your team that needs to be uniform internally? Have you made sure that they have all of those tools and that they understand how to use them? There could be training that needs to be involved in that. And I think those are some of the questions that sales leaders and sellers are really grappling with now.
So I'll give you some perspective on that from my lens at Vengreso. I mean, we're in the business of delivering digital selling training, and it's virtual. And for about the first month of COVID, we were impacted negatively, just basically because everybody was, right? The economy just came to a screeching halt.
Oh, yeah.
But then eventually, and fairly recently, things picked up, and they picked up dramatically because it's like a light or a switch was flipped, Jillian. Like sales
Hmm.
leaders all of a sudden realize like they still have to train salespeople. They're at home, their buyers are at home, but they don't have the skills, the requisite skills to do this virtual selling, this
Hmm.
digital selling. And so, the phone and the email, well, guess what? These buyers are being bombarded by phone and email in their
Oh,
home
there's so much
offices.
fatigue. There's so
Yeah.
much buyer fatigue right now.
So you made the point of video. Well, if you schedule a video call, like on a platform like Zoom, for example, well, that's a synchronous meeting, meaning the two people have agreed to
Hmm.
meet, but the salesperson still has to reach out to someone to get agreement to meet with them, right?
Oh, totally.
So that's where asynchronous video can come into play. And to your point about training, that's exactly what we're seeing. And a shameless plug, I mean, we have a training offering on that. And guess what? It's doing great because there's so much need for that. Sales leaders recognize that their sellers need to know how to shoot video. And it's way more
Mhm.
than just pressing the record button on their phone and doing a selfie. There's legitimate skills that need to be developed to learn how to do that. But it's all in the spirit of that pivot that we're discussing here on B2Bs
Mhm.
and how they have to go virtual in order to meet their B2B buyers.
Yes. And I loved that you mentioned asynchronous video. I feel like it doesn't get enough credit sometimes. Like there's this notion that a sales call needs to happen live. But even internally at Insider Intelligence, like we use asynchronous video to give company updates because
Mm.
maybe some employees have a call at that time. And sellers need to be mindful that every buyer is different right now. And that's always the case. Every buyer is different because every company is different. But now there is that human element there. Your buyer might, maybe their spouse isn't working. Maybe they're home with kids. Maybe
Mhm.
they live in New York City by a subway. I don't know if you're picking it up. That's me. And, it's really noisy at certain hours of the day. There are different circumstances. And so being flexible with your buyer, I think then leads to empathy. And flexibility means that, well, maybe you can't join this call right now, but I recorded this video. I've uploaded it at the link. Take a look at your leisure, and giving buyers that kind of space so that they can learn, they can do research, they can engage when it works for them. I think can give some air to the conversation. Make the buyer feel less pressured, and oftentimes those little things I think can lead to pipeline movement, to moving the deal down the funnel.
Yep. Yep. By the way, cannot hear the subway in the
Oh,
background. Testament to your microphone. Good
oh,
microphone that's only picking up the immediate audio of your voice.
I
So
love
I
it.
do not hear any subway in the background. But I can relate, being a former, original native New Yorker, so I can relate. But anyway, I digress. So on this topic of video, just a couple more points on it before we move on.
Totally.
There's a data point that you mentioned in the state of sales report. I don't remember if this data point comes from that report, but it is a LinkedIn data point.
Mhm.
So we can source it if it's not the state of sales report. And it's the following, and that is that video messages sent on LinkedIn have a
Mm.
5 times greater response than a plain text message. Text meaning, you can just type someone a message on LinkedIn, right? Instead, if you upload a video, if you deliver a video in that message, it
Hmm.
has a 5 times more response rate, which,
Interesting. I
which
I mean, I've looked at the report. That could have been in there. That was a really robust report. Is that within, like, the Sales Navigator platform?
just LinkedIn.
Just
It doesn't
LinkedIn?
make reference to Navigator, it being unique to Navigator.
Yeah, that's
So,
that's really
yeah.
interesting. I think that right now, like obviously, one of the other pivots that I talk about in my report is this notion that the message needs to pivot, and I think that the message needs to pivot means what you're saying and how you're saying it, but also the format that you use to say it. And that's really interesting data to see that video might be something that's more palatable to buyers now, who might be fatigued and just like reading too much. That is an interesting data point.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of data, you've got some data that you prepared in advance. I'm looking at a chart that you supplied here that talks about how sales professionals really have seen the impact on their business. You want to share some of that data, and then we can include the visual in the show notes?
Oh yeah, happy to do that. And that is again from that LinkedIn report. That it was really a great report, and it asked salespeople in North America what they anticipated to change during the coronavirus pandemic. And this is from March 2020. So I think it's important to put the caveat that this was pretty early on, at the start of kind of the lockdown that was associated and the economic uncertainty. But 60% said that they anticipated a decrease in hitting their quota, closing deals. 55% said that they would see a decrease in pipeline, and 44% actually noted that they anticipated that they would have less responsiveness to their outreach from buyers. So buyers would be less likely to get back to them, when an email was sent, a phone call was made,
Mm.
et cetera. So I think that this really points to that the outlook for sales specifically, can seem a little grim. There was also some interesting data from Dun and Bradstreet that indicated that about 60% of B2B respondents noted that they'd seen a decrease in the number of first-time sales conversations since the start of the year. So it's
Hmm.
really harder to connect with buyers. One reason for that could be that, buying by committee is obviously the way that B2B companies buy. And now you have individual stakeholders that are at home. So it could be harder to connect.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the biggest thing is if you're marketing or trying to have a sales conversation with a company that's in an industry that has been incredibly impacted by COVID-19, those conversations are going to be fruitless. They're going to be really hard to gain traction. Like if you're selling into, airlines, for example, who at the start of the pandemic really took a big hit, or if you're trying to reach out to a specific company that maybe furloughed employees, they
Hmm.
don't want to talk to you about your product or service unless your product or service is somehow helping them navigate this storm. And that goes back to pivoting the message, which is a marketing issue and a sales issue. So how can our product, how can our service really, assist, help, um, give the proper tools to businesses that are trying to figure out how to recover, how to navigate, how to do business in some sort of usual fashion. And that's why, you look at early in the pandemic and, software buyers were cobbling up subscriptions to Zoom and all of these other platforms that we just talked about because they were
Hmm.
a necessity. So it's about figuring out how to show your audience that your product or service is a necessity to them during this time.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the things that you pointed out, and I just want to put sort of an exclamation point on it,
Please
Jillian,
do.
and that is that when we're reaching out, whether it's a marketing message or it's a salesperson reaching out to individual, that every situation is unique.
Mm.
Everybody's situation, while we share the common thread, if you will, of everybody's impacted by COVID, their individual circumstances are unique to them. And in many, many cases, as you pointed out, it can be challenging, it can be different and difficult, right?
Mhm.
I was talking to a CEO the other day, who's going to be on my podcast here in a few weeks, and we were doing a Zoom call. My first question to her was, "How do you like working from home?" And she said, "I hate it. Can't wait to get back to the office and rub elbows with people." And she
Yeah.
said that metaphorically because she's not going to be rubbing elbows with people with social distancing. But the point, Jillian, is that it's a big adjustment for a lot of people.
Yeah. No,
You know,
it really is, and it's important to just realize that the buying process is no longer, I mean, it was always complicated in B2B, but it's even more complex now. And that kind of leads to, I think, another related pivot, which is really the importance of ABM. And I like to think about it as like intentional targeting. Like buyers are being more intentional. So therefore, marketers and sellers need to be more intentional. Like it's a really easy thing to understand, but it's a lot harder to do. And Bernie, when we spoke, that was probably right before COVID, maybe like February,
yeah,
and it was a totally different world we were living in. And in my research on account based marketing, I talked a lot about the importance of having quality customer data, of making sure that you do account identification, and any of that work that was done in a pre-COVID world, I think needs to be audited. It needs to be reviewed. Is this data still accurate? Are these target accounts still the right target accounts? It goes back to what I said before, like don't sell into companies that are struggling unless you could offer a value add to them.
mhm.
So I think B2Bs need to be cognizant that refining segments, thinking about ABM approaches is important, but it's not like a set it and forget it type thing. It's something that needs to be reviewed now for sure.
Totally agree. And because you are in this unique position, Jillian, of talking to so many people, you
Mm,
basically interview for a living and then write up all those insights into research
exactly.
reports. Sounds like fun, by the way.
It is a really cool job. I'm not gonna lie. I'm
Yeah.
really lucky.
Um, so are you seeing, and I know it's only been a short time
Mhm.
because COVID really, in terms of the pandemic, has only been with us a few months, but are you seeing companies saying, okay, we recognize that we really have to get serious about ABM, but we're a deer in the headlights, or are
Mhm.
you seeing them saying, okay, we're just going to go from second gear to third gear or third gear to fourth gear? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Part of the analysis in my report was really that, and actually part of the analysis in my ABM report that I interviewed you for is basically like mature companies that have been doing this for a while are more set up for success in ABM. Like it's definitely a kind of crawl, then
Hmm.
walk, then run type scenario. Like you can't just set it up overnight. It's real change management internally. And then, of course, like the aligning of marketing and sales team, like that takes a lot of time and work. I did speak to a couple of the partners over at McKinsey and Company, and they said that they're actually working with even more B2Bs now than they were before COVID because B2Bs are like, okay, I got to get serious about my customer data. I have to figure out, how I should be targeting. How do I revisit, some of the things that I had set up, the automations that I had set up in a pre-COVID world. I have to turn those off. I have to revisit them. And a lot of them are reaching out to, different consultancies, different vendors, and kind of asking for more help and to figure that out, to figure out how to vet customer data. So this is really a pivotal moment, I think, for B2Bs who haven't been serious about their marketing transformation to get serious. Like now is the time to reset, take stock of your CRM data, and think about how you can prioritize that in a way that makes you more effective in the future and going forward.
Yeah, there are, as you mentioned, some industries have been hit hard, like airlines, for example, and hospitality and that kind of thing. And then there's industries like data, our
Hmm.
industry, virtual training, because we've been a virtual training company from day one, as opposed to traditional in-person training, who's had to pivot to virtual, right?
Yeah.
So those businesses that are now providing value and are in high demand have also had to do some pivoting in terms of messaging and how to market, how to sell, and how to deliver because
Hmm.
there's increased demand. So the pivot is kind of multi-dimensional. Are you seeing that also?
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's so funny as you were talking about that. That's another one of my things. It's like now is the time to serve and support your customers. Like that's another pivot that I call out in my report. I think B2Bs can't forget that their first and foremost job is to serve their current customers. And just as buyer needs are shifting and changing, customer needs are shifting. What a B2B organization needed in February is no longer what they need now to do business and to conduct business. So it's imperative that B2B companies take stock of what their customers need and figure out if there's a way to support them that's a little bit outside of the box, maybe a little bit custom than what's currently on the shelf, and what the current offering is. And really, similar to how salespeople need to be, have that flexibility, have that empathy, and really provide support. Because at the end of the day, at one point in time, hopefully, this is all going to be behind us and we're going to go back to some sort of new normal. But customers, buyers are going to remember the companies that did it right and the companies that really flopped. And they're not going to want to support those companies. I think there's going to be like a little bit of a reckoning if companies don't really get it together now and try to be as thoughtful and service oriented as possible.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
wanna note that that's beyond kind of the, like, platitude of, like, hashtag "we're in this together" and pandemic hype. I think that it's really easy to get caught up in that, but there needs to be an authenticity there too.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's well said. Well said. Now, is that point this part of the pivot that we're discussing on this
Mhm.
podcast? This part meaning the ABM, the pivot to ABM. Is that what's in your ABM only report, or is that also part of your pivot report that you mentioned earlier?
Totally. It's definitely part of my pivot report. And of course, within it, I make mention that I published this ABM report. We actually published it right at the start of the pandemic, which was so hard for me as an analyst that spends like, 2 months researching a topic and realizing, oh, like a lot of this, it isn't 100% relevant anymore because I
Mm,
talked about how events are so important, and now those aren't part of it.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, in terms of pivoting, that doesn't mean ABM isn't important anymore. It just means you have to rethink what's your mix, what channels are you putting, what like types of buyers journeys have you crafted, and how are those different now? Like, should I be spending more on search ads because I'm not having in-person events? That way I could capture buyer intent, like those types of things, and figuring out how that works in an account-based play.
Okay. So I want to segue to my summary, but before I do that, Jillian,
Please.
why don't you give a shout out to the link to where that report can be found on your website? I know that it's a either subscription only or behind a paywall, but there's a summary, if I'm not mistaken, that people can read and learn more about it, right?
Yes, definitely. So, anybody who's interested can go to eMarketer.com, and honestly just search for B2B best practices in a COVID world. The We're recording this podcast before the report publishes, but once this podcast publishes, my report will be live on the site. And
Hmm.
yes, there'll be an executive summary, and you'll be able to see most of the charts that are featured in the report and a list of who I interviewed. I interviewed over 30 people, executives from B2B companies, from agencies, to really get an understanding of how B2B best practices were evolving during this time. And the report will be there, and you'll be able to see the executive summary. But yes, you're right. The full, 8,000 words is behind the paywall.
Fantastic. Well, we, of course, will link that up in our show notes page, which leads me to my summary. And this is, Jillian, where I do kind of a recap on the high points that we discussed. And then when I'm done, I'll be brief, but I'll ask you to just add any commentary, anything you want to add, and then we'll ask you for your digital contact information and then bring the episode to a wrap.
Great.
So we began our conversation with an introduction to eMarketer. You are a principal analyst there, where eMarketer is over a 25-year old company,
Hmm.
now part of Insider Intelligence. But as you said, the eMarketer brand is alive and well. And you're a principal analyst there with the fun job of conducting research and talking to executives around digital marketing and B2B marketing and sales. And I think you said marketing transformation. Isn't that the way you kind of framed it up?
Yeah, which is essentially thinking about digital transformation and how it impacts marketing. So just what
Exactly.
it sounds like.
So perfect for the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. And we, of course, we're here to discuss the two things that we're seeing in B2B companies in terms of how they're pivoting in COVID. And the first one really is the whole response to having to be very digital and having to be very nimble and flexible. The things that they had planned in 2019 for most of us really went out the window. And so things like in-person events, for example, everybody just had to just say, okay, well, they don't exist anymore. So, but also pivoting, like, how do you equip sales? Marketing was very busy trying to figure it out, but then sales, you made the comment, was kind of left in the wilderness, if I wrote it down correctly.
Yep.
That's an interesting way to frame it, Jillian, because we at Vengreso have actually experienced the same thing. Like sales was kind of forgotten about, and it was up to the sales leaders to actually take some action.
Hmm.
We discussed how in a report in the state of sales report that like 70% of salespeople are using video conferencing. And then we talked about the importance of also using personalized video messaging and how it's 5 times more responsive when you send a video message on LinkedIn than just a regular text message on LinkedIn. And we talked about how that is really a form of asynchronous video communication, which can be very effective in selling. But you pointed out a use case where it can be effective in internal communication as well.
Hmm.
And so the messages really need to pivot to the current messaging, to the unique circumstance of every individual, and to really understand how the companies that you're trying to reach out to, how they were impacted by COVID. And in some cases, if they were impacted very negatively, then just consider either not reaching out to them and from a sales standpoint or reaching out to them from a human standpoint just to show support.
Hmm.
And we talked about how the other pivot is around ABM, account-based marketing or account-based selling, depending on which definition you want to go by.
I just like account-based approach. It
Yeah,
governs both marketing and sales, in my opinion.
I agree. I agree. I like something you said here. I wrote it down, and I want to say this here again with an exclamation point. You said that buyers are now more intentional. I love
Hmm.
that. consequently, marketers need to be intentional and sellers need to be intentional in terms of how they go about doing what they're doing, how marketers go about marketing, how sellers go about selling. And so when we look at the target lists that we've identified, our account-based target lists, well, we have to audit them. Are they the right accounts now in the COVID world?
Mhm.
You said that the mature companies who've been doing ABM for a while, they're better positioned to really do that audit and to do the pivot from their account-based strategy standpoint. The alignment of marketing and sales teams takes time. So those that have been doing it for a while are just better positioned to do that pivot. Those that haven't been doing it for a while really have more of an uphill climb. But what we're saying here is that there's really not much choice in the COVID world.
No, you gotta do it.
Yep.
Now is
You
the
also mentioned
time.
exactly, exactly. You also mentioned that you talked to McKinsey and that they're working with more B2Bs and that those B2Bs are really focused on customer data, identifying who to target, how to target, and that how customers really need to reach out and talk to different vendors about the customer data to really ensure that, it's accurate and it's going to be viable in the COVID world and really take stock of your CRM data. Boy, I can relate to that even though we're a small company compared to big brands. Something we put a lot of energy into is our own CRM data. It's
Mhm.
mission critical. And you also said that now is the time to serve and support your customer, and that even from an account based standpoint, that's still an important pillar in an account based serving, right? Is serving that current customer, and their needs may have changed. In fact, we know they've changed, not may have changed, they have changed. So we've got to pivot to meet those needs.
Mhm.
And then we kind of wrapped it at everything we discussed here today is in this awesome new report, B2B best practices in the COVID world. You mentioned it's available at eMarketer.com. You conducted 30 plus interviews. So I'll leave my summary there. Jillian, is there anything that you would like to add before we bring it to a wrap?
Well, I loved hearing you summarize everything that I had said. I think the last point, and this kind of puts a bow on it, is that like B2B marketers, B2B sellers have an interesting road ahead because they're battling the conflicting pressures of their own marketing budget cuts with the continued need to engage their audience who perhaps doesn't want to be engaged. And digital has to do a lot more heavy lifting than it once did. So it's a really unique time in B2B. And I think there's a lot of pressures ahead, but I think that there's great room to tackle transformation and come out the other side of this, better equipped and better able to talk to your audience down the road.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The pressure that B2B marketers and B2B sellers are under are still around. We've got to market, we've got to sell.
Hmm.
And then buyers have their own pressures dealing with what they're dealing with in the COVID world.
Hmm.
And so, how those two come together, I think, really come back to everything we discussed here today. So, we're not going to rehash that. We'll leave it at that, and we'll drive people to read that report
Great.
that you mentioned. And on that note, Jillian, where can we send my listener to connect with you online, just to connect with you and learn more about what you've got going on at eMarketer?
Yeah. Please go to LinkedIn, type Jillian Ryan, eMarketer, into the search and drop me a message, send me a connection. Always happy to build my network of B2B marketers, B2B sellers that are doing exciting things or facing unique challenges. Because as you said, part of my job is just talking to folks like you. So I'm always looking to connect. Please find me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And your LinkedIn handle is Jillian Ryan Writer, correct?
I'm glad you had it because I was about to just go look it up. Yes, that is
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. Okay. And that's writer as in WRITER, writer.
Yep, as someone who is writing a lot of reports,
Exactly.
exactly.
Well, Jillian, this has been a blast. We could have talked for another couple hours, enjoyed it
Totally.
tremendously. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. Hey, that's a wrap for this episode of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. If you're not subscribed yet, I invite you to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast player. We're available on all the popular podcast listening channels. And hey, I'd love it if you would give the Modern Marketing Engine podcast a rating or review in Apple Podcasts. That really helps others to discover it. We publish a show notes page for every episode with links to the resources that were mentioned during the interview. Just visit our podcast page at Vengreso.com. And that's Vengreso. And remember, just one S in Vengreso. Hey, while you're there, sign up to get the podcast delivered to your inbox each week. And be sure to check out the Modern Selling Podcast, hosted by our CEO, Mario Martinez Jr. Hey, I hope that you'll tune in again next week for another inspiring interview to help you thrive on your modern marketing journey.